His work was pioneering everywhere from computer music to American spectralism to performance art. And yet somehow this isn't a guy we talk about all that much. So let's fix that. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about James Tenney. James Tenney was born in the southwest corner of New Mexico, in the town of Silver City in 1934. He was a child of the American West through and through, from his upbringing in neighboring Arizona to his initial undergraduate studies at the University of Denver, where he studied engineering. After 2 years there, he decided that his early interest in computers and acoustics should lead him to music, not engineering. In high school, he'd heard John Cage play his sonatas and interludes, and well, that really decided his career looking back on it. The pull of music became so overwhelming that he packed his bags for New York City, where he studied piano at Juilliard, and then finally north to Bennington College, where he finished his tripartite bachelor's in 1958. Vermont, though brief, was formative. Tenney came across a copy of Charles Ives' Concord Sonata while at Bennington College, and he set about learning it. Those who knew him later in life were stunned by his ability to play the whole thing from memory. Up in Vermont, Tenney was in Carl Ruggles' neck of the woods, and I'm sure the two talked about Ives. Tenney idolized him, and Ruggles was Ives' friend. Ruggles didn't have that many friends. He was known for being really cranky, not given to a lot of close personal relationships. Tenney seems to have been something of an exception. It probably helped that Tenney thought a lot of Ives, and thought a lot of Ruggles' music as well. Tenney would analyze Ruggles throughout his career. Tenney was a born academic, and academic music in the United States was on the verge of an explosion of funding and interest. Electronics were going to be the next big new thing. All the cool schools were doing it, and it was right up Tenney's alley. So he was off to the University of Illinois to get his master's. Tenney was part of the first generation to mess with computer-assisted composition. At the time, electronic music was either recording and splicing magnetic tape on crude machines, or a question of learning to punch code in on fussy, hulking room-sized synthesizers like the RCA Mark II as shared by Princeton and Columbia. A lot of early computer music was just as tedious. It was about getting the program to work, rather than creating something that sounded all that interesting. Tenney really cared about the potential for musical applications of technology, and it helped that he had studied with Edgod Varese, whose ideas about electronic sound production so exceeded the technologies of the time that it literally made him depressed. Tenney went to the University of Illinois, he said, because it was one of the few places where you could study electronic music, which he did with Leger and Hiller to not much success at first, actually. No surprises there. It's no fault of Hiller's. Tenney learned a lot about information theory, but he was really disappointed with how purely electronic music sounded. The timbres just weren't there. The technology was new, but it couldn't do a ton, and everything you could do was painstaking. In other words, Tenney was frustrated by the medium, until in desperation he turned to the music of Elvis Presley, slicing and dicing blue suede shoes into his collage number 1, Blue Suede, over the course of 1 week, which, if you've ever messed with that technology, is nothing short of astonishing. Tenney found overlap between electronic and acoustic composition. For Blue Suede, familiar source material, he pulled the Ives trick of putting development of material before the statement of that material, such that Elvis, whose music would be familiar to most listeners, coalesces out of an Elvis-y soundscape. When it's But tape music was still tape music. It wasn't computer music. That was also just getting started. In 1957, Max Matthews, who was then working at Bell Labs, a storied R&D outfit that created many of our core modern technologies, created the first synthesis software called Music. This guy is so important to computer music that the Max of Maxim SP is named after him. Matthews was clearly a genius at this stuff, but he wasn't a composer exactly. Far be it from me to gatekeep that or any other term, but in my reading, Matthews was more on the tech side of things. What he wrote was more proof of concept for whatever computer program he'd been working on at that time. After his time at Illinois, Tenney went to work at Bell Labs from 1961 through 1964 as a resident artist. Matthews was then up to version 4 of his music program, and Tenney was the first true composer to make use of it. He had the creative skill set and the technical know-how to really make these machines sing. And he did so by cutting against the grain, insofar as there was any grain to cut against so early on. His first instrument, if you call it that, was a noise generator, which he used to make his noise study in late 1961, a soundscape inspired by his commute by car through the well-trafficked Holland Tunnel. Noise, random frequencies essentially, they're just a part of life. But if you want them in your computer music, you have to introduce them, you have to program them in. This was part of his solution to these blank and lifeless timbres that he so disliked. Another was to mess with frequency and amplitude modulation, and he found that combining random and periodic frequency modulations across a whole spectrum produced a more complex and therefore more interesting sound. That inconsistency what we now might call a form of humanization, is trivial using digital software. A lot of computer music, especially when it started going, was algorithmic in some way, because that's the advantage of a computer. It wasn't really about getting neat sounds. The timbre quality of Matthews' first experiments is, well, I think this thing, which is mostly a calculator, gets you more interesting sounds, but this is from the late 70s, so it's got a couple of decades on max. What computers can get you is music that conforms to the rules you code in. It can help you write a piece of music. This was Tenney's philosophy. The computer was not a glorified performance machine that executed code. That was a specialty over at the Columbia-Princeton lab. The Mark II could generate theoretically any timbre, but it wasn't a decision-making partner. Computers needed to be a partner to their composers in their creative processes, opening up new fields, generating new ideas, at best, teaching composers things. This Cagean shock of introducing randomization and chance and giving some control over to a program to do something within certain predefined parameters, that's not something that electrical engineers like Max Matthews did. Tenney's electronic work is evidence that he was thinking in perceptual groups and sounds. He took parameters of different parts of music and he would plot them on these XY axes over time. It's an understanding of music and musical architecture that maps really well onto computer-assisted composition. You still have to turn theoretical concepts into a form that a computer can understand. You have to formalize them in some way. And what Tenney, his teacher Hiller, and Iannis Xenakis all turned to around the same time was stochasticism, where you specify the boundaries of what's possible within a parameter and where the average is, and the material flows from there. It's music based on probability. That's admittedly a kind of vague description of stochasticism, but what Tenney, Hiller, and Xenakis were all doing was actually pretty different. The medium was new and they were all going about it using their own unique angles. Tenney and Matthews worked together to expand the music program. Using a tedious programming language called Fortran, they wrote programs where each parameter's mean and range values could be specified. Then Fortran would spit out quasi-random material based on those initial inputs. By varying those starting levels, Tenney could shape the large-scale form of a piece and let the computer worry about all the details. The result were the 4 stochastic studies and dialogue, the latter being a conversation between noise and tone controlled by Tenney's stochastic program. The closest thing to a score for the piece are Tenney's graphs, showing each parameter over time. In 2.5 years at Bell Labs, Tenney produced 6 computer pieces, started even more, and ended the process a radically different composer. He put his theories into practice, theories that he'd set out in his master's thesis. Actually, we really need to talk about this book. Tenney's master's thesis, meta+hodos, from 1961, is both visionary and kind of difficult to read, in the way that fantasy novels, whose authors coin a lot of terms, can be difficult to read. It's influential enough to be on the shelves of any decently stocked music library, which is good, because for many years, this had a mythological status. Larry Polanski wrote that meta+hodos had a wide underground readership long before it got published, which seems crazy to me for a music theory treatise. Like it's a thesis paper, not the Star Wars holiday special.
Stir, whip, whip, stir. Stir, whip, whip, stir.
But such was the state of music theory, this insatiable hunger for a new paradigm at the time that it was written. For years, many who knew his name knew him as a theorist. He makes no mention of his own compositional activity, such as it was at that point. It's mostly Ives, Schoenberg, Webern, Bartók, his faves. Polanski described the situation in the early 1980s as follows. "It is always astonishing to me how many people I run into who say they've read it, and that it was an important influence on their musical thinking, when the fact is that it is only circulated hand to hand, and that at present new copies are only available by reproducing old ones or by writing to Tenney, which does not necessarily get you one." Reading between the lines, I'm sure Polanski thought some of the folks who claimed they read it were just huffing. They wanted to seem hip and cool like they've read the underground paper. But many of them had heard it, tracked it down, read it, and passed it on to the next person. And Polanski chalked this up to the fact that nobody else was writing solid theoretical underpinnings of contemporary music. There were some technical treatises, some aesthetic expositions, very limited in scope. There wasn't analysis that tried to posit a new paradigm. I think some of the difficulty people still have with meta+hodos is because he wrote it when he was still early in his career. You tend to get better at explaining things the more experience you have in explaining things. It's the reason all my old videos are terrible. Even so, I'm pretty sure you can only boil this sauce down so much, because what he's trying to do is come up with a meaningful music theory for all the diverse styles of the 20th century, and as you can see, it's not particularly big. This actually contains another volume called meta+hodos, which he wrote in the mid-70s, tried to boil it down to a glaze or something. This metaphor is becoming really strained. "A musical theory that does not maintain a direct and vital connection with musical experience cannot be expected to survive for very long," Tenney wrote. Tenney pointed out that 20th century music was, it still is, frankly, described in terms of negatives, what it lacks, whether it be tonality or rhythm or form. We can say something as atonal, athematic, whatever. To him, this is evidence that music theory needed to catch up to practice. Let's take this Beethoven sonata. This single note isn't going to tell us much of anything because there's not enough context. We don't know where it fits in the harmony or the meter, but zoom out and find a chord, and that's something that you can analyze. It's not much, but it's something. It's a meaningful unit of information. In tonal music, the triad is the smallest analyzable byte of information. Tenney's argument is that the 20th century saw such an explosion of complexity that complex chords tell you as much in Bartók as the single note tells you in Beethoven. Composers began using more complex sound events, not in lieu of chords, but in lieu of notes. So to understand a Bartók, or Ruggles, or Rodez, you have to look at the context. If any sound could be used, the sounds themselves relinquish their individual ability to carry musical meaning. It is instead context alone that provides the meaning, the ways in which the music invites listeners to group events together, on local and then on ever larger levels. What Tenney builds to is the first application of theories of Gestalt psychology to music. So instead of weighted terms like chord or melody or phrase, Tenney suggests the word clang, a cognate of the German Klang, which is famously hard to define or translate, but kinda sorta means chord or sound. Tenney borrowed it partially because of the cognate, and partially because clanging is a good word to describe the character of much 20th century music. A clang is any sound or configuration thereof that listeners immediately perceive as belonging to a Gestalt, a larger unified thing or whole. Another German word. Things that sound together or very close together without interruption were clangs. Clangs could also be short melodic fragments that produce coherence by being close together in pitch space and or played by the same instrument if they're more disjunct. There are very few hard and fast rules in his theory because it's a listener-centric analytic approach where perception is key. Proximity and similarity of musical materials are what build greater and greater gestalts, which ultimately create form. Anything between a half second or 3 seconds could be a clang. That was Tenney's general window. Anything shorter than a half second would be perceived as an element of a clang, while larger values would be perceived as at least 2 clangs. Linguistics has this concept of the morpheme, which is the smallest unit of meaningful linguistic expression. Tenney is trying to set boundaries around what listeners hear as a musical morpheme, the smallest meaningful unit that's probably composed of multiple sound components. he posited the existence of temporal Gestalt units, or TGs, which are subsets of the musical flow that listeners hear as one single thing. Each TG has 7 certain quantifiable parameters, and each of these parameters has a range and a mean. Form is stringing together these units on various levels, and his levels were, in order of size going up, elements, clangs, sequences, segments, sections, and finally the whole piece. His critique of previous theory, among many things, was that it was too focused on pitch, when pitch was just one parameter of many. He cites this as the underlying reason for criticisms levied at 20th century music, which prioritized rhythm, timbre, and noise. Your ability to make sense of something is directly related to how close or far you are from that thing. Tenney likens this to a wheat field. If you're up close, each stalk looks totally unique and dependent. You see all the differences between them, but you get far enough away and the individuals go away. You see larger patterns as the wind blows through them, zoom out even more, and you see the whole wheat field as part of an even larger whole. Tenney argues that when listeners fail to understand music, or when theorists can't grapple with a certain kind of music, that's a discrepancy of scale. It may be Ives throwing a bunch of different elements at you in one piece. It may be Weber writing these tiny little pieces. These composers can sound cacophonous or fragmented if you're not willing to meet them where they're at in terms of scale. The 20th century brought with it also a greater rate of change to every parameter of music. For listeners to understand music that uses more extremes of register, a music that uses less regularity in phrase structure, music with complex pitch relationships, they have to sit with the work for a while. He compared this to looking at an abstract painting. It takes a while to refocus your brain on the patterns and relationships of the objects on the canvas. With a good abstract painting, there is a visual grammar, a logic. There's just nothing you can recognize, so it takes you a while. But given enough time, your brain will find meaning and structure in something that, at first glance, appears to be structureless. Tenney remained a prominent music theorist and musicologist, on a parallel line to his compositional career. Quite different from meta+hodos is his book, A History of Consonance and Dissonance, and my favorite detail is that the words consonance and dissonance are in quotation marks. This book sets out kind of what I've said before on this channel. There's a strong cultural dimension to what we hear as consonance. It's not about how composers use consonance and dissonance. It's about theoretical and cultural uses, which he demarcates into 5 stages, roughly corresponding to prehistory, medieval times, the Renaissance, the emergence of functional harmony in the Baroque era, and ending with the theories of Hermann von Helmholtz, who took a scientific approach to acoustics in a way that cared about instrumentation and dynamics, and other considerations that were not pertinent to prior conceptions of consonance. Tenney returned to writing about temporal Gestalt theories throughout his career. In 1978, he proposed a Fortran program that could analyze a melodic input and try to figure out its shape and form. Tenney believed that computer analysis was the future as a compositional aid and as a technique for making analytical points. Like, you probably could train an AI model today to try and figure out what you would hear as a clang in a piece. Like, he once subjected the complete works of Carl Ruggles to computer-assisted statistical analysis to create graphs that showed how much better Ruggles got at his own brand of atonality throughout his life. Tenney remained in New York after his time at Bell Labs. For the rest of the 1960s, he was immersed in the avant-garde culture. He taught in Brooklyn and had a research position at Yale, where he had access to the Ives collection. He co-founded with Philip Corner and Malcolm Goldstein a group called Tone Roads, an homage to Ives's pieces with that title. This core trio accrued players to perform Ives, whose ensemble music really needed champions at that point, and would come to include the music of other American mavericks of Ives's time and after. And this was the 1960s, when it was the first generation of contemporary ensembles were coming up. People weren't just doing that sort of thing. Tenney was also a member of Steve Reich's and Philip Glass's early bands. His work in electronics reached its zenith with 4Ann Rising, a pun on the name of Tenney's then wife, Ann Rising, spelled differently. This piece consists of overlapping ascending sine waves, each separated by a minor sixth. I wouldn't be surprised if he got the idea from Roger Shepard, a colleague at Bell Labs during Tenney's time there. Shepard tones, named for him, are an aural illusion of continuous ascent or descent. They're sine waves stacked not in sixths, but in octaves, and they're faded in and out to create a sense of continuous movement. He gave a workshop in Fortran to a group of composers and performance artists in 1967, but by and large he moved away from heavily computerized music towards the performance art scene. The first generation of minimalists, which of course included Philip Glass and workshop attendee Steve Reich, had grown out of the Fluxus movement. And Fluxus specialized in performance art, happenings, and all manner of indeterminacy. Fluxus was still going strong when Tenney began writing his theater pieces, concentrated in the middle of the 1960s. They don't have traditional scores. These are text pieces that describe the circumstances under which sound may be produced. Take metabolic music, which asks for electrodes attached to human skin that control sound and lights. Sounds a little Lucier, doesn't it? Tenney approached traditional scoring through the untraditional medium of the postcard, collectively known as his Postal pieces, which he wrote because, as he said, he hated writing letters. He preferred to send postcards. The set began in 1965, although most date from 1971. Tenney gave the starting date for this collection as 1954. Not sure where he got that one. These are all pieces where the processes are supposed to be very apparent from the outset. Freed from the drama of large-scale form and the mental energy needed to keep track of that form, listeners could hear deeper into the sounds. It's sound, he said, for the sake of perceptual insight, some kind of perceptual revelation. The Postal pieces are all different and tailored to their dedicatees. Some are text pieces, some are graphic scores, others are more conventionally notated. The most famous one is probably having never written a note for percussion, which is usually played on tam-tam, though no instrument is specified. It was probably Tenney's first note for percussion. I don't think he was fibbing about this. Maximusic asks for percussion, but it's a text piece parodying European contemporary music, so I think that really was his first actual note. Tenney's music is experimental, in the best sense of the word. His work is his theory in action. His theory, although never about his own work, elucidates its principles. Meta+hodos, his electronic work, and his Postal pieces all unite form and content. Tenney's view was that these were the same thing, albeit on different structural levels. So he pioneered computer music, swerved right into performance art, and then wrote a set of rags for solo piano. And when he got hired to teach at the California Institute of the Arts, his style changed yet again. He was always doing something a little bit different. He stayed at Cal Arts from 1970 until 1975, and would return to the faculty in 2000. In the interim, he taught at York University in Toronto, Ontario. Tenney had a keen sense of history and his place within it, writing homages or borrowing material, taking something familiar and alienating it through some process. His drum quartet, Wake for Charles Ives, takes an ostinato from Ives' Fourth Symphony and subjects it to a canonical procedure until the material reaches its maximum density. As much as he loved Ives, his two biggest influences were his one-time teacher Varese and his friend John Cage. Taking after Cage, Tenney never wanted to make sounds mean anything other than just sounds. Now, Cage's ideas about sound and silence made a huge impact on Tenney's thinking. No surprise there. Cage is one of those figures that if you come after Cage as a composer, you have to engage with his ideas on some levels. Not just because Tenney was a personal friend. Like, even if you reject Cage's ideas and philosophy, lack of familiarity is a sin if you're going to be in this business today. And what Tenney got from Cage is this idea of freeing some parameter of music from the composer's direct control. Tenney used the term ergodic form for any music where what happens at any layer of structure is statistically identical throughout the work. No matter how you slice an ergodic piece, if you look at a small fraction or a large section, each is going to be about the same when you're looking at the means and ranges of all the different parameters. It's sort of like making a pie. Like, unless you really mess up, each slice of pie, regardless if it's, a 16th or half, is going to have the same flavors, it's going to have the same textures, the ratio of filling to crust is going to be about the same, and so with a pie, you can start and end anywhere. Now I'm trying to think of a food that's not like that, and I'm having trouble. Doesn't help that it's 1:30 in the morning, because my first steak was out of focus. Ergodic Form first appears in Ergodos 1 for John Cage, consisting of 2 tapes that could be played forwards and backwards in any combination, either alone or together. It's intentionally shapeless music. What I find interesting about it is that after the initial rendering, Tenney went back and tweaked the probabilities to achieve what sounded ergodic. The first one, which was ergodic, didn't sound like it was. For the listener, ergodic forms are meditative. If you're writing some kind of generative music for an installation, as I've done, it's gotta be ergodic because everyone who comes into the gallery, no matter how long they stay there, deserves a statistically similar experience. In concert, that stasis lets the mind wander. If you realize that the music is basically not changing in at least one respect, you'll have more mental energy to pay attention to the other aspects. Or you'll just get bored and sneak a peek at your phone. I've seen undergrads who need a concert credit for their Gen Ed classes act, and let me tell you, it is disgraceful. You can also free listeners' expectations by using simple forms, and Tenney was especially fond of canons and arch forms. Having never written a note for percussion is an arch form. It's also what Polanski calls a swell, a common Tenney dynamic marking taken to its extreme. I think Tenney's asking for the listener to pay very close attention to the subtle sounds of percussion, the resonance it has in the room, in a way you just wouldn't otherwise. Many of Tenney's pieces use a swell or fanning structure. You start in one place, expand outwards to the middle, and then from there contract to the starting point again. You see this in the note for percussion, you see it in his ensemble music all the time. Another Cagean idea was the koan. Cage was a Zen Buddhist before it was hip in the West, and koans are paradoxical questions from the Zen tradition. I can't say 100% for sure if Cage is the reason the koan was such a touchstone for Tenney, but they're friends. One of the Postal pieces is even called koan, and later got expanded to a string quartet of the same name. The early days of minimalism were really quite radical. A friend of the show, Robert Carl, once told me that the minimalists were, I'm paraphrasing here because it's been a few years, the last group of composers for whom the question of, is this even music, was relevant. This is especially true when you look at how minimalism developed from the Fluxus movement. Lamont Young, for instance, his pieces would be like, release a butterfly into the crowd, piece is over when the butterfly leaves the hall. Short and sweet little concepts that could fit on a postcard. Now, there is an overlap between minimalism and spectralism. Minimalism tended to be more American, spectralism more European, but they were responses to the same kind of thing. First-generation spectral composers would orchestrate a timbre as a harmony, and you get a whole piece out of the process of doing just that. A lot of early Gerbaud Grisé has a straightforward form, where you hear the process unfolding. For Grisé and later French spectral composers, the form needed to be more complex, and the spectral processes needed to be more complex, lest you endlessly rewrite Grisé. Tenney found ways of thinking about timbre, about pure intonation, about difference tones, and all these subtle things about acoustics that these French spectralists came to use in their music, and he put them back into what are basically minimalist pieces. Take Critical Band, which uses A440 as a starting note and slowly expands the harmony above and below. Very straightforward, and even if you don't have a score, you can hear what's going on 5-6 minutes in at most. And yet, because we're so unused to hearing pure intervallic relationships, he's able to write a straightforward process piece that results in some exquisite timbres, despite, this really kills me, despite not once specifying a single instrument. It's an open instrumentation piece. It's orchestration not by instrumentation. It's orchestration by interval and by acoustics alone. And he gets these amazing sounds out of it. It's unreal. When I first encountered Tenney's music in a detailed way, it was when I was making my spectralism video, and Tenney's work really seemed like an exception to the overarching idea of spectralism as this European phenomenon. Some of his pieces are very much in this fold, like the spectral canon for Conlon Nancarrow. Tenney wrote the detailed liner notes to the first major recordings of Nancarrow's player piano studies, and was inspired to write his own player piano canon of 24 voices, each an overtone of a low A. Tenney used a computer to help map the logarithmic proportions between these voices. Nancarrow himself, in gratitude for Tenney's liner notes and piece, punched the score on his custom machine down in Mexico City, which is sort of like coming up with a special birthday cake recipe for a good friend, and then forcing your friend to bake it because you don't have a steam injection oven. It's so late. Why am I laughing at steam injection ovens? Where I think Tenney's spectralism shines is in his ensemble music, like Diapason, which requires very precise tunings and seating arrangements. Strings always play open strings, and the winds are sandwiched between string players so they can hear what they're supposed to tune to. The result is this shifting mass of sound that, like a lot of good spectral music, I swear, sounds like it has electronics in it. A more straightforward example of Tenney's spectralism is in Harmonium No. 1, which sets out the rules of harmonic and proportional relationships in a series of ever-evolving just intonation chords. Exact tempo and instrumentation is up to whoever's playing. Larry Polanski likens what happens in the harmonium pieces to the literary technique of multiple perspective. Musically, this can mean a presentation of material in different guises. In Harmonium No. 3, this means hypnotic arpeggiations played across 3 harps tuned ever so slightly apart from one another. You get different colorations of the same notes throughout. Another interesting take on spectralism are the 3 indigenous songs, which are supposed to simulate human speech using acoustic instruments. Now, if you've ever heard these complex MIDI piano renditions of pop music, you'll know it's possible to hear imitations of other sounds voices even, using contemporary analysis and acoustics. Tenney's not going that far. With just a few wind instruments and a small percussion setup, there's no way to discern words, but the pitches follow the voice's formants, and the percussion provides imitations of the F's and the P's and those sorts of sounds. Like a Zen koan, Tenney's not interested in whether or not there's an answer. Asking the question is good enough. Tenney's music sits at the intersection of the artistic movements at the heart of the 20th century, but he doesn't fit into any one category. Conceptual post-fluxus minimalist spectralism is word salad, it's meaningless. So when you're trying to teach neatly about any of these movements, you tend to limit your focus to the folks who fit squarely inside the lines, and that leaves artists like Tenney, who consistently defined and crossed these genres, just hanging out to dry. In Paul Griffith's Modern Music and After, which is this breezy summary through the post-war musical world, he places Tenney alongside the Romanian spectral composers like Horatiu Radulescu, whose music is more ritualistic and more spiritual than the French spectral school that emerged around the same time. Tenney's string quartet Arbor Vitae, his final piece, even looks a little like a Radulescu score that's, I don't know, cleaned up for a nice date or something. I'm not sure I'd call Tenney's music spiritual in any sense, but there is a ritualistic angle. There is something kind of profound about it that I think came from his background in performance art. James Tenney died in 2006 at the age of 72 from lung cancer. His music shows that you don't have to sacrifice rigor and intellectualism to create something of incredible intensity. You don't have to try to say anything to end up saying something really profound. Maybe that's why Harold Budd called Tenney art's most dangerous man. He knows he's right, Budd wrote, and then shows you why. Friend of the show Kyle Gann put it a different way, highlighting Tenney's role as a composer's composer. No other composer is so revered by fellow composers, he wrote, and so unknown to the public at large. I think it's time we change that.